You've probably heard about the Black Gigantic train disaster, right? Where a train went downhill and crashed in a town, killing 47. But what you didn't know is that in 1997, in Elsterwerda, an almost identical disaster happened. This is the story of the 1997 Elsterwerda train runaway and derailment.
Elsterwerda lies on the Berlin-Dresden Railway, a double-track electrified main line connecting the two large cities on 174.2 km/108 miles of track. Opened in 1872, reduced to one track in the 1940s, the second track was shipped off as reparations after the war, and later returned to two-track configuration. The railway is one of Germany's most important railway lines, and has been upgraded several times in recent years, now allowing top speeds of up to 200 km per hour, 124 miles per hour.
But however, what anybody don't know is that this town will become the site of a horrific train disaster.
KC 71153 was a chartered freight train carrying diesel and gasoline from a refinery near Schwedt further north in Brandenburg via Berlin to a storage facility at Nossen in northern Saxony. By the time the train made it to Elsterwerda, most of the trip would be done, with the destination being less than 50 km/31 miles linear distance away. The train consisted of 22 tank cars weighing a total of 1,851 metric tons and was pulled by DB German Railway 155-103 on the section of the journey taking it through Elsterwerda. The DB Series 155 is a 6-axle electric locomotive made in the GDR between 1977 and 1984 to pull heavy freight or express trains. The locomotives, whose boxy design got them nicknamed electric container, due to their similarity with a shipping container, weight 123 metric tons at 19.6 meters 64 feet in length and can reach 125 kilometers per hour 78 miles per hour thanks to their 6 motors putting out a combined 5,400 kW/7,241 HP. By 1997, the surviving locomotives of the type had largely lost any passenger services, being exclusively used for freight trains, especially those carrying liquid chemicals or coal, or in such materials. 2 years prior, it had been decided that the type would get no major inspections anymore, starting the process of retiring the type in favor of the more modern Series 145 and Series 152. The train had been taken to Berlin-Grunau by an unknown locomotive, which was disconnected from one end of the train while 155-103 was coupled to the opposite end to let the train reverse direction. For the next part of the trip, 155-103 was scheduled to take the train to Riesa, where it would be replaced with a diesel engine as the last leg of the route wasn't electrified. On the 20th of November at approximately 5 a.m. DB 155-103 is being coupled to the waiting row of tank cars at Berlin-Grunau. The train arrived with a delay, meaning the shunting worker has to work 3 trains at once as he assists the driver of 155-103 in preparing the train. The driver connected the couplers between the leading car and the locomotive, but, as the following events and later investigation showed, forgot to connect the pneumatic lines for the brakes, rendering the brakes inoperable. At this point the brakes were applied, meaning the train wasn't going anywhere at this point even if the driver had tried departing. At this point normal procedure means the driver was to use the locomotive's compressor to fill the entire pneumatic system with 5 bar 72.5 C of air pressure. With the disconnected hoses and closed valves, only the locomotive's system filled up within a few seconds. The driver presumably didn't notice that the system had reached the desired pressure much faster than it should take for a whole train to be pressurized. The shunting assistant was tasked with a so-called simplified brake test. As the train had not been split into several parts, he only had to check if the brakes in the rear car could be applied and released, if the air lines were hooked up throughout the train, and if all the valves were opened. The latter would be done by opening the rear valve on the rear car for 15 seconds and having the driver observe a drop in air pressure on the manometer in the driver's cab. The shunting worker did notice that the brakes on the rear car had not released as they should have been, something he blamed on an overloaded system caused by the previous locomotive charging the system with more than 5 bar 72.5 C, causing the new locomotive's air pressure to be insufficient. At this point he should have notified the driver and changed protocol to a full examination of the brakes on every single car. Wanting to save time and walking distance, he chose to manually release the brakes on each car individually on the side as he took care of the other two trains awaiting release, without examining the valves and hoses. With the locomotive disconnected from the train's brake system, this meant there now was no way to apply the brakes once the train started moving. The driver later testified that the shunting worker had given him the signal for a successful brake test, something the shunting worker denies doing. Which of the two men radioed the dispatcher saying the brake test was complete and the train was ready to depart could never be clarified. Neither could anyone explain why the shunting worker didn't have the train stopped just as it started moving if he knew the brakes didn't work. At a slow speed within the station, the locomotive's brakes might have sufficed in stopping the train. At approximately 5:30 a.m., KC 71153 left Berlin-Grunau station, dooming the train. Because of the train's delay, it was decided that the locomotive change to diesel traction would be done at Elsterwerda, with the diesel locomotive being directed to head towards the station to meet the freight train. While this happened, KC 71153 moved through Brandenburg on level or slightly downhill tracks. Having caught a window with little traffic meant there was no reason for the driver to apply the brakes along the way. As he approached Henlipisch, pronounced Hohenlipisch, a town 5 km 3.1 miles up the tracks from Elsterwerda, at 6:35 a.m. the driver was informed of the scheduled earlier stop. The signal box worker at Elsterwerda had set up a path to direct the train into track 5 off the main line, using points with a speed limit for turning trains of 40 km per hour, 25 miles per hour. Coincidentally, Henlipisch also marked the start of a relatively steep downhill section towards Elsterwerda. Only now, as he applied the brakes, did the driver realize that there was no way his train would stop, especially not on a downhill track. The brakes of the locomotive just were no match for the momentum of the brake-less train pushing it downhill. At 6:45 a.m. a regional passenger train left Elsterwerda station. 2 to 3 minutes later, KC 71153 reached the northern end of the station at approximately 90 km per hour, 56 miles per hour. The driver had alerted the dispatcher via radio of the defect, but it had been too late to do anything. Against any expectation,
The train flies off the tracks.
the locomotive remained on the track, but it tore off the train and stopped 177 m/581 feet down the tracks. The leading 15 tank cars derailed between the tracks with some falling over. Moments after the train had reached the station, a fire erupted around the wreckage of the train. The fire department, which had been alerted when the driver reported the brake failure, reached the station a few minutes after the train, arriving just as the first tank car's emergency valves failed to keep up with the heat and the car blew up. The shockwave tore other cars open and ripped the roof off the station building. People later reported fuel raining down on them several hundred meters away. 100 m equals 328 feet. Cars driving down a road adjacent to the tracks were pushed into the other lane as they went along. In the following minutes, 4 more tank cars blew up one by one, aided by the fire department initially not knowing what was on fire and how to extinguish it. The shed of the local depot caught fire. The DB 155-069 parked there burned out. The city's fire chief was killed when a burning bistro next to the station building collapsed in on itself and him. Another severely injured firefighter would succumb to his injuries 5 days later. 7 firefighters suffered severe injuries. A police officer was treated for minor injuries. Even once the fire department knew what they were dealing with, they had trouble fighting the blaze, running out of water in their own trucks and finding the hydrants to provide insufficient amounts. They also couldn't approach the train in the initial hours, fearing more explosions from the train cars which were engulfed in fire. The site is likened to the aftermath of a bombing in World War II, with fire surrounding the firefighters, flames reaching higher into the sky with each explosion. One of the surviving firefighters later recalls his colleagues pulling him to safety as his boots get stuck in molten asphalt. He is flown to the hospital and survives despite severe burns. It took until midday for a locomotive driver to be allowed to drive near the fire and pull away 7 intact, non-derailed cars and thus limit the extent the fire may escalate to. 4 more cars survived intact, as in, without leaking, closer to the fire. They were pumped dry once the fire was declared out. The fire department was fighting fires and heat spots for more than 34 hours, involving 310 firefighters, with 62 vehicles, along with 14 ambulances and 2 helicopters taking care of the injured responders. The driver of the train actually escaped his locomotive, the fire and the smoke uninjured. The severely damaged locomotive shed as well as the bistro were demolished and not rebuilt. The station building, which had only been opened after extensive reconstruction refurbishments in 1992, was repaired along with the tracks and platforms. It takes over 10 years for the soil to be cleaned of the tons of fuel that seeped into it during the fire. Some sources say 50 metric tons, others several hundred tons. The DB initially tries to blame the fire department for the extent of the damage, causing an outcry and quickly being shut down in court. It takes until November 2002 for a trial to start, with the shunting worker and the train driver being charged with negligent cause of bodily harm and negligent interference with rail traffic. The shunting worker is sentenced to 10 months on probation, the driver to 6. Both also have to pay a fine of €500, $600. The DB keeps fighting responsibility all the while. Relatives and surviving responders along with people who suffered property damage are forced into a muddy legal battle. In the end, Mr. Peterson, the fireman whom his colleagues pulled from molten asphalt, is the only one to see it through and get a small, undisclosed amount of money. In interviews he expresses that the sum he got was not even worth the time spent getting it. He no longer works as a firefighter. Scars and consequences from injuries to his feet and legs limit his mobility and flexibility. He also can't push the traumatic images aside. On the day he was one of the first 3 men to approach the fire. The other 2 don't survive. 5 men he ordered to wait in the cover of a house survive, with injuries when an explosion collapses part of the building. It's generally agreed that the blaze could have been even worse, had more cars exploded, especially if one thinks of the nearby residential area. Something like that happens later in Italy. The 2009 Viareggio derailment sees a train carrying LPG derail and catch fire with the blaze reaching nearby residential streets. There, 32 people die. DB 155-103 sees its minor damage repaired and returns to service, later being sold to a private rail service provider. Against the DBS plans, the Series 155 is still in service today. About a dozen still run for the DB along with a handful more in private hands. Freight trains still run on the same line with the same cargo, regularly rattling through Elsterwerda station. Today only a small memorial stone with a metal plaque tells passerby of what happened, complimenting the 2 men who died fighting the blaze. Then again, you can't forget that the events of the day are still very present in the memories of those who witnessed it or were involved, so they probably don't need more reminders. A few years after the accident, the city, following relatives' wishes, replaces the annual memorial service with one every 10 years.
But that wasn't the only time a train is derailed in a city. In 2009, the Viareggio train derailment occurred, killing 32. Maybe I'll do a documentary on that in the future, but it's been 29 years since the accident, and hopefully we never see another fire wreck ever again.